Hey everyone, let's start tonight with something that the medieval world was really good at: paranoia. Before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights and maybe turn on a fan to make a soft sound in the background. And let's take it easy as we go on our journey tonight. If you were a king in the Middle Ages, the safest thing you could eat was nothing. The royal kitchen wasn't really a kitchen. It was a dangerous place in the Middle Ages, where every pot, pan, and smiling servant could be a sign of a possible murder. The cooks were doing more than just cooking. They were doing biochemical warfare every day, sometimes on purpose and sometimes by accident. Imagine it. You are the most powerful man in the kingdom when you walk into your kitchen. The comforting smells of boiling meat, burnt bread, and that one fish that should have been buried months ago. The head cook swears it's fresh, which means we get rid of the flies. And that's before the conspiracies even begin. Kings hired tasters to keep themselves safe. It sounds like a noble title, but when you realize it means, please eat this mystery stew and let me know if it kills you, you realize it's not. It's the only job where surviving lunch is a promotion. These tasters would bravely try every dish. The king ate if they lived. The king ordered takeout if they didn't make it. Takeout means more soup, but from the other cook who doesn't look as scary. But here's the shocking truth. It wasn't dramatic for medieval kings and queens. Poisoning was almost a sport for the whole country. Why go to war to take down a throne? Marching armies, spending money, and sweating when you could just put something strange in the royal porridge. For example, King John of England. Chroniclers say he poisoned at least one rival, which is pretty much true. He was so petty that he lost the crown jewels in a swamp, so killing a relative was probably just another Wednesday for him. On the other hand, the Byzantine Empire made killing people with food a sport. Courtiers traded poisons like kids today trade Pokemon cards. Some emperors didn't even bother to rule. They just waited for dinner, put their hands on their stomachs in a dramatic way, and then let the next cousin take over. Even the kitchens of the Pope were not safe. More than one important person conveniently died just before an election. Chroniclers said that God wanted people to not ask questions about what was floating in the wine, which is a medieval idea. So yes, kings were paranoid, but not enough. Every meal for the royals was a conspiracy theory that needed proof. There was a threat in every bowl, a cliffhanger in every spoonful. In medieval Europe, staying alive didn't depend on bravery, strength, or God's favor. It was about having a taste. Who truly cared about you? Two big fears in medieval Europe were anything that moved in the woods after dark. Anything that moved in the woods after dark while singing, which brings us to the most interesting conspiracy theory of the time. Pagan cults that are secret and live in the woods, where they do illegal rituals under the moonlight, probably without shoes, and definitely not clean. People in the village said these groups were real. The church said these groups were real. Local cats probably swore that these groups were real, and sadly for the Middle Ages, the conspiracy was 100% true. But instead of imagining robed wizards calling up demons, think of something that is much more true to history. A few tired peasants sneaking into the woods to sing old songs, burn herbs, and pray that their crops stop failing. Life in the Middle Ages was hard. During half of the year, you were starving, and during the other half, you were trying not to die from the weather. People were going to light a candle in the woods and talk to the old spirits if it made them feel better. And they did. These groups weren't bad. They were more like illegal support groups with incense that smelled a little better. The church, on the other hand, saw things differently. Anything that wasn't stamped approved by Rome was automatically a satanic plot. Enter the forest cult hunters, priests who went into the woods with torches, holy water, and no idea how to survive. Most of the time, they fell over a path, yelled at an owl, and then went home saying they scared off a demon. But every now and then, they found something real. Rock, circles. People still used them, set fire to bundles of herbs in strange ways. Symbols carved into stone that are older than Christianity. 6 peasants who really didn't want to talk about their hobbies. The Benandanti in northern Italy were the most well-known of these secret groups. People who said they really left their bodies at night to fight witches and protect their crops. And the crazy part is that they believed it. The church questioned them, hoping to hear about demons, but instead they got medieval Avengers roleplay. Then there were the forest magical healers, mostly women, but some men, who used herbs, salves, moonlight rituals, and maybe some light chanting to help people get better. It wasn't against the law to practice herbalism if you were good at it. And then it was devil magic out of nowhere. Yes, the rumors were true. There were secret pagan cults in the trees in Europe during the Middle Ages. Not bad, not scary, just very determined not to let the church ruin their good time. I'm sorry to tell you that if you grew up thinking that medieval monks were peaceful men who quietly copied books and baked bread, that some of them were basically the CIA in robes. Villagers prayed, nobles plotted, and kings worried about their soup. But the monasteries were doing something very different as part of their holy mission: getting information. And yes, that's what they used to call spying. The church, which was the biggest organization in Europe, needed to be able to see everything. And who better than monks? They could read and write, were quiet, and had already learned to watch people sin with the same intensity as a judgmental cat. They went from one monastery to another, gathered rumors that were really confessions, and wrote them all down in well-organized manuscripts. You could say they are historians, but the more correct term is intelligence analysts who write better. The Dominicans were the worst or best, depending on how much you like organized paranoia. Their whole order was based on getting rid of heresy, which meant talking to villagers, reading letters, and keeping an eye on people a little too closely. If a man from the Middle Ages sneezed near the wrong, a Dominican friar magically appeared and asked follow-up questions about the scripture. Monks who traveled were great spies. They could go anywhere in the kingdoms with letters that no one wanted to look at because no one wanted to go to hell for bothering a monk. A lot of kings secretly paid monks to tell them about scandals in the court, troop movements, and whether their nobles were planning a suspicious feast. It was like a subscription service in the Middle Ages. With the rise of the Inquisition, things got even more interesting. The church now had a whole organization whose job it was to gather evidence against people. Monks talked to heretics, questioned locals, and wrote down the most interesting rumors to send up the chain of command. Some reports were very bad. Revolts against the government, illegal pagan rites, and secret rebellions. Some of them are like gossip magazines from the Middle Ages. Brother Gregory says that people saw the shoemaker's wife at night carrying herbs that looked like they could be witch herbs. More surveillance is needed. Not every. Of course, some monks were spies, but there were enough of them that people started to notice. People in the village said that the monasteries knew everything, and they were right. A monk could walk into a town, buy bread, and ask 3 polite questions. Then, all of a sudden, he would know more about your marriage than your spouse did. So, the conspiracy was real. In the Middle Ages, monasteries ran a quiet network of information, secrets, and surveillance across the continent, even though they were known for their chanting and candles. And unlike most institutions in the Middle Ages, it actually worked. The sword, the crossbow, and even poisoned stew weren't the most dangerous weapons in the Middle Ages. It was a monk who remembered a lot. If you asked a medieval European what the Knights Templar were up to, they'd probably whisper something like, "Oh, you know, guarding treasure, hoarding secrets, worshipping mysterious heads, controlling kings, threatening the Pope, inventing banking, summoning demons, normal night stuff." Medieval people loved a dramatic conspiracy, and the Templars were their favorite target. The best part is that some of it was true. The Templars started out as a small group of knights who swore to protect pilgrims. They were noble, holy, and admirable, but then they got a terrible curse and became successful. Within a century, they were so powerful that kings had to plan their paranoia around them. The Templars owned castles, land, fleets of ships, and more money than half of Europe. They were basically a medieval version of the Navy SEALs, the Federal Reserve, and that one hut your aunt keeps looking into online. And with great power comes great suspicion. Rumors spread that the Templars guarded a huge treasure hoard. Unfortunately for Europe, this part is true. They were the first to create a Europe-wide banking system. Pilgrims would deposit money in England and withdraw it in Jerusalem, which seemed suspiciously modern for people who still feared mirrors. The Templars kept coded records, operated secure vaults, and moved money with the kind of efficiency that scared kings. And tax collectors were very angry. Then there were the secret ceremonies. Templars met in private, held ceremonies at night, and made oaths that no one else could see. Of course, this made Europe think they were worshipping a mysterious severed head named Baphomet, which is medieval for, "We don't know what they're doing, so let's assume the worst, the truth." Their rituals were secret because they involved confessions, discipline, and rules for the organization. Boring, but medieval minds couldn't accept boring. They needed drama, and they got it. King Philip IV of France, who was always broke and very good at blaming others, thought the Templars were heretics, which is medieval for "I want your stuff." He had them arrested, tortured, and forced to confess to things that were so ridiculous that they make modern conspiracy theories look shy. But here's the twist: Philip wasn't completely wrong. The Templars did have a treasure, run a secret empire of money, and keep knowledge hidden from the public. Not demonic knowledge, just banking procedures and military codes. But for medieval Europe, that was basically the same thing. So yes, the Templars were victims of lies, but also absolutely guilty of being too powerful for their own good. Their secrecy wasn't dark magic. It was good bookkeeping, which in medieval Europe was practically witchcraft. Anyway, when the Black Death rolled into Europe in 1347, people naturally began looking for answers. What caused it? How did it spread so fast? Why did it seem to prefer crowded cities and men who never washed their hands? Most villagers blamed demons, bad air, or their neighbor's weird-looking goat. But a particularly juicy conspiracy theory emerged. The church knew more about the plague than it publicly admitted. And disturbingly, this time, the conspiracy wasn't entirely wrong. The papacy and the higher clergy had access to medical reports, merchant letters, and incoming ship logs that ordinary people never saw. They knew when outbreaks were spreading through port cities. They knew when trade routes were falling apart. They knew that whole monasteries were falling apart like flies. And while peasants were still out in the fields wondering why their neighbors suddenly burst into boils, bishops were quietly packing their bags and moving to countryside villas with better airflow for a while. To be fair, medieval clergy weren't doctors. Half of them thought illness came from bad humors, and the other half thought it came from God being mildly angry. But they did have one thing that was clear: information was an advantage. In the Middle Ages, information moved slower than a peasant on a Monday morning. There are records of bishops closing city gates before waves of plague without explaining why. Monasteries locked themselves from the inside. Clergy warned each other in coded letters with phrases like, "The ship brings dark tidings," which is medieval for, "Do not go outside, everything is on fire." The quarantine orders were even more suspicious. Some were given before the plague was even visible in the area. That meant that someone somewhere knew something. Merchants noticed it too. Venetian traders wrote about strange warnings from church officials telling them to stay away from certain ports a week before the plague broke out there. That's not divine prophecy. It's insider trading with extra steps. Meanwhile, the official advice given to the public was less helpful. People were told to repent, pray harder, burn aromatic herbs, or avoid excessive joy. Yes, really. Joy was considered a plague risk, committed to suffering. So, did the church intentionally hide things? Probably not with malicious intent, but they absolutely prioritized themselves and withheld timely warnings because they didn't want to cause panic, lose authority, or admit they had no idea how to stop it. In the end, the peasants weren't wrong. Someone did know more. They just weren't sharing. If you picture medieval monks as peaceful men humming hymns and tending herb gardens, it's time to gently set that image on. Fire. Because hidden among the holy texts and the chanting were certain specialists, discreet gentlemen, problem solvers, men who could recite the Psalms from memory and also eliminate a political rival without disturbing the choir practice. Yes, medieval Europe had cloistered assassins. And no, this is not the plot of a questionable Netflix show. It was real. These men weren't monks by spiritual calling. They were monks by convenience. Joining a monastery gave you shelter, food, legal protection, and the ability to travel between kingdoms without anyone asking why you had a suspiciously heavy bag. Monastic robes were basically the medieval version of an all-access VIP pass. And who hired these holy hitmen? Nobles, of course, the same people who were already trying to poison each other's soup. If a noble wanted something done quietly, efficiently, and with plausible deniability, he didn't send a knight. Knights were loud. Knights bragged. Knights tripped over their own armor. No, he sent brother, someone who shouldn't be asked questions. These monks were often lay brothers, members of the monastery who performed manual labor and didn't spend their days copying manuscripts. They had strong arms, few witnesses, and an excellent excuse for traveling. I am collecting arms. Nothing suspicious there, except for the dagger tucked under the robe. The chronicles never say these men existed openly, but they leave clues. Too many clues. A noble dies mysteriously. A political rival conveniently falls from. A widow, a stubborn landowner, suddenly repents, donates everything to the church, and vanishes. Monks appear in letters complaining about brothers who fail to observe spiritual discipline, which is monastic code for someone keeps sneaking out at night, and we don't know where he's going. There are even recorded cases of monks being about with weapons, disguises, or heretical correspondence. None of them confessed, of course. Monks had excellent poker faces and the added advantage of implying that any. People thought that accusations were an attack on God himself, and kingdoms let them happen. Why? Because monasteries solved problems quickly and quietly, with little cleanup needed. So yes, medieval villagers whispered that some monks were more dangerous than their sermons suggested, and for once, the villages were absolutely right. Behind the candles and the psalms, some monasteries housed men who could pray for your soul and send you to meet God personally. When people think of witch hunts, they think of the 1500s and 1600s. Bonfires, pointy hats, angry men yelling about Satan hiding in their goat. But the truth is that secret witch hunts were happening long before they became fashionable. Medieval Europe didn't wait for the Renaissance to start panicking. They were already terrified and already correct about some things. Before the official witch craze, villagers spoke in whispers about wise women gathering herbs at night. These were not broom-flying sorceresses. They were the local healers, midwives, and unofficial therapists, the people you visited when you couldn't afford a doctor, which was always because doctors in the Middle Ages mostly recommended bleeding you to death. These women knew plants, cures, poisons, childbirth, and how to make your husband's headache disappear, sometimes permanently. Their knowledge was extremely valuable, which immediately made the church suspicious in medieval Europe. Knowing things was practically a crime. So, villages created their own little conspiracy theory. These women were part of a secret network sharing forbidden knowledge under the moonlight. Herbs were coded messages. Knotted cords were symbols of protection. Midnight gatherings were strategy meetings. And although it all sounds dramatic, it wasn't completely wrong. There were networks of healers who trained each other, passed down knowledge, and shared dangerous remedies quietly so the church wouldn't accuse them of witchcraft. But mistakes were made. Some women cured illnesses the church failed to cure. Some predicted storms better than priests. Some fixed marriages with love. Potions that definitely broke a lot of rules. Of course, this meant they had to be working with Satan. When animals died, blame the healer. When crops failed, blame the healer. When your husband ran off to join the Crusades because you kept nagging him about taking out the chamber pot, the healer must have cast a spell. But under all the hysteria, the conspiracy theory had a bit of truth to it. There really were secret meetings of magical practitioners, but their magic was just science, herbs, and experience. In a world run by superstition, competence looked supernatural. So, medieval villagers began hunting witches long before the official manuals existed. They charged them in local courts, questioned them in barns, and occasionally tried to drown them in rivers. These early witch hunts were sloppy, chaotic, and extremely unprofessional, but tragically real. The irony, the only witches who actually existed were the ones trying to keep everyone alive, which in the Middle Ages was suspicious. Medieval kings were very dramatic. They loved big gestures, heroic speeches, pointless wars, and sometimes even faking their own deaths, or at least making everyone think they did. And the crazy thing is, medieval people suspected this. They whispered about it in taverns and passed rumors down through the generations. In at least one deliciously messy case, their conspiracy theory wasn't completely wrong. Enter Holy Roman Emperor Frederick, a man so strange, so smart, and he was so far ahead of his time that Europe really didn't know what to do with him. He spoke many languages, loved science, wrote poetry, and kept a personal zoo, which made him seem suspicious to medieval peasants who thought that any man who liked books was probably consorting with demons. Frederick II died in 1250 in a grand public way that everyone saw. The church breathed a sigh of relief, and Europe buried him. Everyone moved on. But they didn't, because almost. Rumors spread right away that Frederick wasn't dead. He was just hiding, resting, waiting, and getting ready to come back and take back the empire like a medieval Batman, but with worse armor and better falconry hobbies. Entire cults formed around the idea. People said they saw him wandering through forests in disguise. Merchants said they met a mysterious nobleman who paid in Frederick's old coins. A fisherman said the emperor asked him for directions. Peasants swore that a hooded figure attending Mass in Sicily had the same posture as Frederick, which is a very specific thing to notice unless you're obsessed. You'd think this was typical medieval delusion, but then things got complicated. Into this chaos walked Richard of Eastwell, a man who claimed to be Richard III's secret son centuries later. Another suspiciously educated, suspiciously refined stranger who refused to explain his background. He spoke Latin, he knew royal etiquette, he had the bearing of someone who never carried his own laundry. Frederick's exact posture was the same as that of a Mass in Sicily, which is a very specific thing to notice unless you're obsessed. You might think this was typical medieval delusion, but then things got complicated. Richard of Eastwell, a man who claimed to be Richard III's secret son centuries later, walked into this chaos. He was another suspiciously educated, suspiciously refined stranger who refused to explain his background. He spoke Latin, knew royal etiquette, and looked like someone who never did his own laundry. Historians still argue about him. In both cases, something is undeniably off. Medieval rulers occasionally staged dramatic farewells, vanished for months, or switched identities for political safety. And since recordaping was essentially Bob wrote it down before spilling wine on it, who could truly confirm anything? So yes, the conspiracy theory stood on shaky but tantalizing legs. Sometimes kings didn't die. They retired in secret, letting everyone else deal with the mess. And in a way, who could blame them? If you lived in a world of plagues, rebellions, crusades, and poisoned soup, you'd fake your death too. Few things terrified medieval Europeans more than water. Not demons, not plague, not taxes, water. Because water was unpredictable. It could nourish your crops, drown your children, or give you dysentery before breakfast. So when people started dying mysteriously, villagers did what medieval villagers always did: blamed the nearest well. The poisoned wells conspiracy spread like wildfire. If your family got sick, it was the well. If your livestock died, it was the well. If your bread burned or your cousin tripped over a chicken, the well was clearly cursed. The Middle Ages had a very flexible relationship with cause and effect. But beneath the panic and shouting, there was a sinister truth. Sometimes wells really were poisoned, not by witches, demons, or suspiciously shaped clouds, but by rival towns, invading armies, and the occasional extremely angry neighbor. During medieval sieges, poisoning wells was basically standard procedure. Armies would dump dead animals, toxic plants, or anything particularly disgusting into the enemy's water supply. Nothing says, "Please surrender," like finding a decomposing goat floating in your bucket. Siege manuals even recommended it. Imagine a military guide that calmly advises Step 3, sabotage their plumbing. European villages, however, didn't know about siege tactics, so when people started dying miles away from any battlefield, villagers invented their own explanations. Outsiders were the favorite suspects. A traveler passing through, poisoner, a merchant selling herbs. Definitely a poisoner, someone who looked like they could read. Don't even get started. One of the darkest examples occurred during the Black Death, when towns accused Jewish communities of poisoning wells. It wasn't true, but the tragedy highlights how deeply the conspiracy had rooted itself in medieval minds. Water was dangerous, mysterious, and perfect for accusations. And yet, even in peaceful times, wells could become toxic. Rain washed waste into them. Dead rats fell in. Moldy leaves fermented into a medieval smoothie of death. Most wells were basically unfiltered holes in the ground, surrounded by people who bathed once a year and thought germs were part of astrology. So, were wells poisoned? Technically, yes, but mostly by bacteria, something medieval people would have considered witchcraft. Anyway, the irony is painful. Medieval villagers terrified each other with stories of secret poisoners, while nature did most of the poisoning for free. But when the whole world feels unstable, you pick simple answers. And in the Middle Ages, the simplest answer to anything was the well did it. Medieval Europe loved a good identity crisis. If someone walked into town claiming to be a long-lost prince, people didn't question it. They immediately threw a feast, argued about lineage, and started sharpening pitchforks just in case. And this wasn't because medieval people were gullible. They were, but that's beside the point. It was because royal impostors actually happened frequently. In a world without photography, fingerprints, dental records, or even consistent spelling of names, identifying someone was basically a group guess. Does he look royal? Was the medieval version of a background check, and looking royal usually meant having all your teeth and not smelling like onions. Enter one of the strangest cases, Richard of Eastwell. According to local stories, he appeared in Kent in the 1400s, claiming softly, politely. He claimed to be the secret son of Richard III, which was a bold claim. But then he showed skills that no ordinary peasant would have, like reading Latin, writing beautifully, holding utensils correctly, and not flinching when people talked about taxes. He never said it outright, but he hinted heavily, and since medieval England loved drama, people believed him. Historians still argue about his origins centuries later because the details fit just a little too well. Medieval record keeping might as well have been done on napkins, so the possibility remains deliciously open. But Richard wasn't alone. Medieval Europe was crawling with resurrected royals. A popular example comes from Anastasia of Poland, who died young, supposedly only for several women to later appear claiming to be her, complete with court knowledge and suspiciously familiar mannerisms. Entire regions went to war over whether someone was or was not a princess, because nothing says healthy governance like a battlefield full of men yelling, "That's definitely her," even though they didn't know what she looked like. And then there were times when imposters weren't imposters at all. During crises, some rulers fled, hid, or tried to escape assassination by disguising themselves. A king or prince in plain clothes wasn't a conspiracy theory, it was a safety strategy, which meant that every mysterious stranger story had a thin layer of truth underneath. The real problem was that medieval politics loved a good plot twist. If a royal died under suspicious circumstances, which was always, people immediately assumed the body was fake, the death was staged, or the ruler was living incognito somewhere, probably regretting every choice that led to monarchy. So, yes, royal impostors were a medieval conspiracy, and that conspiracy came true so often that eventually Europe stopped asking, is this possible? People always thought the body was fake, the death was staged, or the ruler was living in secret somewhere, probably regretting every choice that led to monarchy. So, yes, royal impostors were a medieval conspiracy, and that conspiracy came true so often that eventually Europe stopped asking, is this possible? Okay, which cousin is pretending to be dead this time? If you've ever wondered what the medieval equivalent of a restricted, if you want to know what the section looked like, picture a small, dusty room inside a monastery that was locked with 3 bolts and guarded by a monk who looked like he hadn't slept since the Third Crusade. Inside, there were shelves of books that the church didn't want anyone to read, and villagers whispered about them like they were cursed objects. And here's the twist: these forbidden book vaults really existed. The church controlled most education in medieval Europe. If you wanted to read, write, or do anything more mentally stimulating than counting sheep, you had to go through them. Naturally, this meant they also controlled what you weren't allowed to read. Anything that threatened their authority, contradicted scripture, or suggested that the earth did something scandalous like move, was quietly removed from circulation. But they didn't burn everything. Burning is messy, smoky, and attracts peasants who will definitely ask questions nobody wants to answer. Instead, they stored banned texts in special archives known as aeraria, scriptor vaults, or in some cases, it was just the locked room that only Brother Thomas could enter. He always looked guilty when he came out. What was inside? A surprisingly diverse mix. There were heretical gospels that said things that could get you interrogated faster than you could say Inquisition. There were Arabic science books that were clearly correct, but inconveniently ahead of Christian doctrine. There were medical treatises that made bishops faint when they talked about anatomy. There were even ancient pagan. Medieval for I was curious and didn't want to get in trouble, monks copied manuscripts for research purposes. The best part is that church officials often argued about these vaults. Some thought the knowledge should be kept safe for future generations, while others thought it should be locked away forever because it raised too many uncomfortable questions. For example, if this pagan text correctly predicts an eclipse, what else is it right about? Silence, awkward shuffling, and a bishop coughing loudly to avoid further discussion. These vaults weren't mere rumor, they were policy. When inquisitors seized the libraries of accused heretics, they didn't destroy everything. They cataloged it, studied it, filed it away. Knowledge, even forbidden knowledge, was power. The conspiracy existed because people sensed exactly what was happening. Somewhere in those monasteries were books that could change minds, challenge authority, or reveal truths medieval Europe simply wasn't ready for. So were the villages. Right. Absolutely. Behind the incense, behind the chanting, and behind the locked oak doors, the church kept a carefully curated treasure trove of knowledge. And like all treasure in the Middle Ages, the best way to protect it was to pretend it didn't exist. If there was one place in medieval Europe where conspiracy wasn't a theory, but a daily lifestyle choice, it was Italy. Venice, Florence, Milan, Genoa, Siena, all beautiful places today. But in the Middle Ages, they were basically high budget gangster movies with better architecture. These city states pretended to be peaceful trading centers for hundreds of years while secretly waging a silent, non-stop war of espionage, bribery, and back alley diplomacy. For years, Italians whispered about a shadow conflict that was going on beneath the official alliances and treaties. It was a secret war of spies, saboteurs, coded letters, and accidents that only seemed to happen to people who were politically inconvenient. The conspiracy sounded dramatic, even theatrical. Unfortunately, every part of it was. That's right, the Italian city-states were very jealous. If Florence made money, Siena had a crisis. If Venice signed a trade deal, Genoa threw a fit. If Milan built a tower that was a little taller than their neighbors, a feud broke out that lasted 3 generations. These places competed in everything: business, banking, architecture, fashion, and even murder. Yes, murder was considered a cultural achievement. Out of all this chaos came one of the most advanced spy networks in medieval Europe. Venice was especially good at it. Legendary. The Venetian government set up a whole secret intelligence council with coded messages, financial surveillance, diplomatic intercepts, and a network of spies all over Europe, like paranoid confetti. Their enemies were scared of them, their friends were scared of them, and even Venetians were scared of them. Venice also had the infamous Bosch de Leon, public drop boxes, where people could anonymously report crimes, conspiracies, or that their neighbor was acting suspiciously Italian. These messages were reviewed by an underground council that decided what needed to be looked into, discouraged, or quietly gotten rid of. Italy didn't come up with the deep state, it just made it look better. Florence had its own spy network run by the Medici family, who were so rich they could have bought the idea of honesty and still said, maybe later. Florence was known for bribery and banking manipulation. Milan was known for intimidation. Genoa was known for naval sabotage. And Siena was known for pretending it was minding its own business while absolutely not minding its own business. The result was a constant, silent war. No armies marching, no banners waving, just merchants disappearing, letters rewritten, alliances snapped overnight, and treaties accidentally lost in fires. So yes, the conspiracy theorists were right. Italy wasn't just fighting wars, it was fighting all the wars, but quietly, politely, and always with impeccable style, long before the Da Vinci Code convinced half the internet. That Jesus had a secret family living comfortably in France. Medieval Europe was already obsessed with holy bloodlines, hidden heirs, and scandalous genealogies. The conspiracy was simple. Noble families were secretly descended from sacred or royal ancestors, and they were hiding the proof. Villagers whispered it. Nobles denied it. Chroniclers recorded it with the energy of men who enjoyed gossip more than journalism. And the best part, some of it was true. In medieval Europe, legitimacy was everything. You couldn't rule a village, you couldn't even run a kingdom without waving your family tree around like a holy relic. But family trees in the Middle Ages were a mess. There were affairs, wars, and the occasional mysterious baby that showed up during a pilgrimage. People pretended not to notice. It was all very polite and very suspicious. So nobles came up with a solution: hide the embarrassing branches and make the impressive ones look bigger. All of a sudden, half of Europe's noble families said they were descended from Charlemagne, a man who, if these lineages were correct, must have fathered about 4,000 kids. Others said they were descended from Trojan ancestors, Roman emperors, or King David. Medieval genealogists were not historians. They were creative writers with quills. But there were real hidden bloodlines. Letters found hundreds of years later showed that illegitimate royal children were quietly placed in monasteries, foster homes, or faraway country estates with the vague instruction, "Raise this boy and do not ask questions." Some came back, some didn't, and some had. It took 500 years for descendants to find out that great-great-grandma wasn't a peasant after all. She was the secret daughter of a duke who couldn't control himself. One of the most interesting examples is the Capetian dynasty of France, which secretly supported certain noble houses financially for generations. These houses were suspiciously linked to lost royal babies. At the same time, English chroniclers wrote about hidden heirs living under fake names during civil wars, waiting for the right moment to take back the throne, which usually meant never. Never, ever. And then there's the church. Monks sometimes wrote angry notes like, "Another noble child has been given to us." Origin is medieval code for somebody dropped off a baby again, and no one will tell us whose it is. So, was there a conspiracy around holy bloodlines? Yes, but not because they were sacred. They were secret because they were scandalous affairs, hidden heirs, swapped identities, political insurance babies, all tucked away behind thick castle walls. Medieval Europe didn't need mythical descendants of Christ. It already had enough royal drama to last until the apocalypse. When medieval Christians whispered about secret Jewish and Muslim networks operating beneath the surface of Europe, they imagined something dramatic. Shadowy conspirators trading coded messages, plotting rebellions, and coordinating across kingdoms like a medieval Illuminati. Naturally, the church panicked, kings panicked, villagers panicked, and the goats panicked because goats always panic. But here's the twist: almost no medieval person was prepared for. The networks actually existed, just not for the sinister reasons people imagined. They weren't planning world domination, they were planning survival. During the Middle Ages, Jewish and Muslim communities were frequently persecuted, overtaxed, expelled, or on particularly stressful Tuesdays, accused of poisoning wells, summoning demons, or staring too suspiciously at bread. So, to avoid extinction, these communities created underground ways to talk to each other and get away. They were quiet, secret, and not meant to overthrow anything but their own bad luck. These networks included safe houses, coded routes, friendly merchants and doctors who traveled in disguise. Whole families fled across borders using prearranged signals, like a lamp in a window, a scratched doorway, or the phrase, "Is the pomegranate harvest good this year?" which was medieval code for, "Hello, I am in danger and would like to. Leave right away." Jewish communities had informal transit routes that went from France to the Rhineland to Iberia. Each stop was supervised by someone who had mastered the ancient art of pretending nothing strange was going on. Muslim communities in Spain and North Africa, on the other hand, had cross-Editerranean escape paths that moved fugitives, scholars, and persecuted families with amazing speed. Most medieval institutions worked like a donkey limping along. These networks were incredibly good at what they did, even though they were hidden. Christians, on the other hand, saw this as proof of a conspiracy. If a group that was being persecuted managed to survive, it meant they were planning something. This was the logic of the time. They escaped danger, so they must have been planning something. But in reality, these underground systems saved many lives. They kept knowledge alive, protected families, and kept cultural traditions alive during centuries of hostility. Some historians even say that they helped start the first organized resistance movements during the Renaissance. Ironically, the only medieval conspiracy theorists who got this one right were the ones who wanted to hurt people. They thought there was an invisible network, and there was. They just got the whole point wrong. It wasn't a threat, it was a lifeline. So, yes, the conspiracy was real, but instead of planning the downfall of Europe, these networks were doing something very strange for the Middle Ages. They were helping people. Medieval Europe officially ran on feudalism. Kings, nobles, peasants, duties, tithes, and taxes that made absolutely no sense to anyone, including the people collecting them. This was the system everyone talked about. The system written in charters. The system priests preached about while ignoring their own financial habits. But beneath that wonderfully dysfunctional surface existed another system, a quiet, unofficial, unregulated maze of deals, favors, illegal markets, and underthee. Table arrangements known today as the shadow economy in medieval terms. Just how things work, my son. And here's the fun part. Everyone pretended it didn't exist while simultaneously participating in it daily. The conspiracy went like this. Groups of thieves, smugglers, moneylenders, and entrepreneurially flexible peasants operated outside the law, forming networks that stretched across towns and even kingdoms. Secret trade routes, black market goods, illegal borrowing, quiet bribes, all happening. People in the Middle Ages believed in this underground economy. They told stories about it, warned their kids about it, and drew very dramatic lines in the sand about how sinful it was. And they were right. Start with the thieves' guilds. Yes, they existed. No, they didn't wear uniforms. But they organized territories, settled disputes, and punished independent thieves for breaking professional courtesy. Medieval law enforcement was so useless. Thieves set up their own HR department. Then there were the unofficial moneylenders, who often worked out of the back rooms of taverns, monasteries, or that one house on the corner that everyone avoided because charging interest was technically a sin, unless you did it quietly, in which case it was mutual aid. Smuggling was everywhere: salt, wine, grain, wool, ink, iron. If it could be taxed, someone was smuggling it. The king's tariff was more of a polite suggestion than a law that no one took seriously. Before tax collectors came, entire villages would mysteriously lose shipments. Then, just moments later, those same goods would show up in the barn of someone named Petro, who found them on the road. Markets had their own conspiracies. Sellers fixed prices, bakers hid cheap flour in bread, butchers changed weights, fishmongers said their fish was fresh when it clearly died during the First Crusade. Everyone lied a little, stole a little, and nodded politely at Sunday Mass, as if God hadn't seen them cheat 3 customers that morning. So yes, the medieval shadow economy was real, it was thriving, and it was the only part of the economy that actually worked consistently. The biggest conspiracy wasn't that it existed, it was that everyone pretended they weren't involved. Night in Kiang arrived softly, like silk falling over the city, but the pleasure quarters never truly slept. As the sun slipped behind the palace roofs and merchants closed their shutters, another world awakened, one built not on laws or duty, but on. The first lanterns lit up, trembling gently, and the servants carried them out in long chains. Each flame was protected by lacquered shades of red gold and soft jade. Soon, the whole district glowed like a small constellation brought down to earth, shimmering above the cobblestones that had been worn smooth by generations of wandering feet. When a visitor walked through the first archway, they heard the world change. The clatter of daytime markets faded behind them, replaced by the soft. The sound of zithers, the rhythmic tapping of wooden blocks, and laughter coming through silk curtains. Tea houses opened their doors with quiet pride, each one promising a slightly different atmosphere. Some were peaceful and scholarly, while others were lively and full of actors rehearsing lines before their evening performances. The air smelled of roasted barley tea, honeyed pastries, sandalwood incense, and sometimes a hint of plum wine. What made Qifeng's floating world unique was not only its beauty, but its illusion. The feeling that time slowed down once you got inside. Scholars who had spent their days buried in scrolls came to recite new poetry. Government clerks, who were tired of all the paperwork, came looking for a few hours of elegance. Even wandering monks were known to stop at the entrance to the district and watch quietly, as if they were in a different world. The streets twisted like painted ribbons, with each turn leading to a new show. A puppeteer surrounded by children, a masked performer practicing, acrobatic jumps, courtesans behind gauzy screens getting their hairpins, calligraphy sets, and embroidered robes ready. Everything was movement, music, and anticipation, but it was all in a calm, dreamlike order. People who visited often said that entering Kiang's pleasure quarters felt like stepping into a painting where nothing harsh or hurried could touch them. The laughter was soft, the music was round and soft, and the lantern light was warm enough to make even passing faces look poetic. It was a world that was both real and not real, made on purpose to calm the mind, spark curiosity, and make every guest feel weightless, if only for a night. Here, pleasure wasn't loud or crude. It was refined, carefully planned, and wrapped in art. And this was just the beginning. If the entrance to Kei Feng's floating world was a soft breath, then its tea houses were a heartbeat, steady, warm, and always welcoming. They lined the district like polished jewels, each with its own personality, but all sharing the same love for. Some were simple, with bamboo blinds and clay pots, while others had lacquered pillars, jade green tiles, and carved screens showing cranes, plum blossoms, or scenes from operas that people loved. Together, they made a delicate corridor of light and smell that drew people deeper into the quarter. When you stepped inside a tea house, you stepped into an atmosphere carefully woven from ritual and intimacy. The first thing you noticed was the smell of toasted barley, chrysanthemum petals, osmanthus blossoms, or the deeper, earthier warmth of old bricks softened by time. Servers moved with practiced grace, gliding between silk cushions and low wooden tables with trays of steaming cups arranged like miniature constellations. Conversations stayed quiet, as if even laughter respected the delicate balance of sounds and flavors. These tea houses were more than just places to drink. They were places to listen, social theaters, and safe havens for wandering thoughts. Scholars came here to argue about poetry and philosophy, challenging each other with new verses quickly written on fresh scrolls. People who wanted to be officials talked about their chances of passing the exam, pretending to be calm while hiding their anxiety. Merchants made deals under layers of polite formality, and soldiers passing through the capital sat quietly, enjoying a few hours of peace before going back to harsher duties. But the real charm of these spaces came from the courtesans who performed in them. Unlike the women of the brothel, these artists were prized for their mastery of. They recited poems with gentle clarity, played zithers with strings that sparkled in the light, and painted calligraphy that flowed so smoothly it seemed to breathe. Their presence didn't overwhelm the room. Instead, they shaped it with each movement, which was always balanced and planned. Visitors often felt like the tea houses had a secret rhythm. Voices flowed like soft rivers, music rose in delicate waves, and the sound of porcelain cups clinking punctuated each moment like a quiet heartbeat. Some guests came looking for silence, while others came looking for pleasure. Some people came to talk, while others came to enjoy the peace and quiet. But everyone left with the same feeling. Time seemed to slow down and become gentle, as if it wanted to sit and enjoy one more cup. In Kaifeng's floating world, pleasure began not with desire, but with calm, and the tea houses were the best place to experience this. As night fell in Kaifeng's floating world, the tea houses let out their last trails of steam, and another sound began to rise, the distant thrum of drums, the flutter of silk sleeves, and the warm chorus of voices, filtering from the district's many theaters. These were the soul of the pleasure quarters, places where imagination was not merely entertained, but completely unbound. To enter a Keong theater was to surrender oneself to dreams painted in movement, color, and song. The buildings themselves were wonders of careful craftsmanship. Some were simple wooden halls with open stages and benches worn smooth by years of use. Others rivaled temple architecture with carved rafters, dragon-headed beams, and facades, decorated with scenes from ancient myths. Lanterns hung overhead in tired arrangements, casting a golden glow that softened every contour and turned the audience's faces into floating shapes of anticipation. Inside, actors prepared behind screens painted with plum blossoms and running horses. Their makeup was not merely decoration, but transformation. White powder to smooth the face into an otherworldly mask. Bold crimson accents to define emotion and ink black lines that could shift in expression with the costumes sparkled in the lamplight. The embroidered robes were turquoise, mustard yellow, snow lotus white, and imperial red, and each one had symbols of the roles they were meant to play. The performances were a mix of poetry, martial arts, dance, and music. A single gesture of a silk sleeve could suggest heartbreak, and the twirl of a sword could create tension like a sudden gust of wind. Musicians sat on one side of the stage, plucking zithers and striking. Wooden clappers, or coaxing long, trembling notes from bamboo flutes. Stories from the past came alive. Generals torn between duty and love. Spirits haunting the mortal world. Lovers separated by family honor. Immortals descending from clouds painted on backdrop screens. For the audience, the theater offered escape of the purest kind. Merchants forgot their ledgers, scholars forgot their exams. Wandering travelers forgot their fatigue. In the pleasure quarters, a well-oiled story could lift a person out of the weight of their everyday life and place them gently into another realm entirely. When the final note faded and lanterns dimmed, guests emerged slowly, as if waking from a shared dream. And as they stepped back into the glowing streets, Kiang's floating world seemed even more magical, as though the performances had seeped into the night itself. In the heart of Kiang's floating world, beyond the tea houses and theaters, lived the figures who embodied the district's deepest allure, the courtesans. They were not just entertainers or friends. They were artists in every sense of the word. They had been trained from a young age in poetry, music, painting, manners, and the subtle art of being emotionally present. To meet a famous courtesan was to meet refinement shaped into a person. Their homes, called Hui Yuan flower pavilions, stood quietly behind carved wooden gates. Some were small and cozy, with soft cushions, shelves of inkstones, and vases of seasonal flowers that changed every day by servants. Others were grand, with inner courtyards, koi ponds, and moon gates through which lantern light drifted like floating petals. Regardless of size, each pavilion carried the gentle fragrance of incense, cosmetics, and newly brushed silk, creating an atmosphere of tranquil anticipation. The courtesan's charm began long before she spoke. Her appearance was a composition in itself. Hair styled into elegant loops, and combed smooth with perfumed oils. Silk robes dyed in hues that flattered her complexion: pale, lilac, lake blue, lotus white, embroidered with subtle threads of silver or gold. When she moved, the fabrics whispered, soft as breath. When she sat, her posture carried the serenity of someone who understood the power of stillness. But their true art was expression. A courtesan could recite a Tang poem with such clarity that each syllable felt like falling dew. She could paint calligraphy characters so fluid that the strokes seemed to ripple like water. She could play the peeper with fingers so deaf that listeners swore they heard not wood and strings, but wind moving through bamboo. Even her conversation carried a gentle rhythm, attentive, thoughtful, never hurried. Visitors sought them not for crude pleasure, but for respite from the world. Scholars discussed verses with them and left inspired officials worn thin by politics found comfort in their patience and wit. Young nobles, restless and uncertain, felt steadied by their quiet confidence. A single evening with a talented courtesan could feel like stepping into a sanctuary where one's burdens melted, replaced by calm. Yet beneath their elegance lay an unspoken truth. The life of a courtesan required discipline, artistry, and resilience. Their refinement was not effortless. It was crafted with devotion. And for those who entered their pavilions, the experience remained unforgettable, a moment suspended between reality and beauty, held gently in graceful hands beyond the flower pavilions, deeper into the dimmer alleys of Kiang's floating world. Stood the establishments that blended art with intimacy, the refined brothel, known for their elegance rather than excess. These were not places of hurried indulgence, but carefully curated sanctuaries where desire was softened by ritual, conversation, and cultivated charm. Even their entrances spoke of restraint. Carved wooden doors, silk banners that shifted with the breeze, and lanterns whose warm glow promised companionship wrapped in grace. Inside, the air carried a subtle mixture of incense, powdered sandalwood, and the faint sweetness of plum blossoms arranged in porcelain vases. Rooms were decorated with folding screens, painted with cranes or mountain scenes, their colors muted under candlelight. Low tables held calligraphy brushes, wine cups, and instruments waiting for performances. Everything was arranged to slow the visitor's breath, to quiet restless thoughts, and to prepare them for a different rhythm of the night. Unlike the courtesans of the flower pavilions, celebrated for artistry above all, the women of these houses specialized in weaving emotion and comfort. They welcomed guests with soft voices and practiced gentleness, guiding conversations with an intuitive understanding of mood. A guest's troubles were never dismissed. Rather, they were absorbed into the warm atmosphere, becoming part of the evening's quiet unfolding. Wine was served sparingly, never to dull the senses, but to loosen stiffness and open space for genuine presence. Honeyed plum wine, chrysanthemum-infused rice wine, or delicate pear liquor were poured into small, translucent cups. Servers moved silently, refilling only when a guest's cup reached its final sip, as if reading minds rather than watching for gestures. What surprised many newcomers was the emphasis on connection rather than physicality. A night here might involve reciting poems, listening to gentle songs played on the peeper, or sharing stories beneath lantern light that flickered softly across walls. Intimacy, when it happened, unfolded gradually, more like calligraphy than passion. Each stroke deliberate, balanced, and mindful. For weary officials, lonely scholars, and travelers far from home, these refined brothel offered something essential, a place where one felt seen, not as a title, a rank, or a burdened mind, but as a person. The women, skilled in both empathy and subtlety, created an atmosphere where vulnerability was met with grace. By the time a guest stepped back into the glowing streets, the world felt lighter. Desire had not consumed them, it had soothed them, shaped into gentle companionship by the floating worlds. Quietest artists. Behind the laughter, music, and gentle bustle of Kaifeng's floating world lay spaces very few visitors ever saw. The hidden gardens and moonlit retreats reserved for the truly trusted, the discreet, or the exceptionally fortunate. These secluded courtyards were woven into the pleasure quarters like secret threads, quiet sanctuaries where the night deepened and the world softened into something intimate and dreamlike. Reaching one often required passing through a narrow passageway, its walls lined with bamboo that whispered in the faintest breeze. A carved gate, simple, elegant, and always half-shadowed, opened into a courtyard, bathed in pale moonlight. Here the noise of the city disappeared, as if caught by unseen hands. The air cooled, the scent of night blooming jasmine and damp stone replaced incense and wine. These gardens were designed with purpose, not to impress through grandeur, but to soothe through harmony. Small koi ponds reflected the moon, their surfaces occasionally broken by a ripple as fish glided beneath lotus leaves. Rock formations were arranged with the same precision found in classical painting, each stone chosen not for size, but for its ability to balance the space. Pebbled paths curved gently, avoiding straight lines, as if to encourage wandering rather than arriving. Pavilions stood at the edges, their lattice windows glowing faintly with candlelight. Inside, low couches were set with embroidered cushions. Scrolls lay open on lacquered tables, and teapots released steady curls of steam. These retreats were not built for revelry. They were built for quiet conversation, unhurried reflection, and the kind of companionship that needed no performance. Courtesans often brought their closest patrons here, not for intimacy in the traditional sense, but for something far rarer, sincerity. Away from the eyes and expectations of the district, masks often fell away. Officials spoke of their doubts, scholars confessed fears, the exams never allowed them to express, and wanderers told stories the roads had forced them to keep to themselves. The women skilled in reading the undercurrents of emotion listened with patient awareness. Sometimes a peeper was played so softly that the notes seemed to float rather than echo. Sometimes only silence filled the space shared comfortably between two people watching the lantern light tremble on the pond's surface. And sometimes, when the moon was high and the jasmine scent strongest, guests felt as though they had stepped entirely outside the world. These hidden gardens were the floating, world's quiet heart, places where pleasure transformed into peace, and where the night itself seemed to pause to listen. In Kiang's floating world, music and calligraphy were not simply pastimes, they were languages, refined expressions that revealed the inner rhythm of the night. While visitors often arrived seeking conversation, comfort, or performance, many found themselves unexpectedly captivated by these quieter arts. They formed the backbone of the district's emotional landscape, turning fleeting evenings into memories that lingered like ink on silk. Music came first, drifting through the pleasure quarters like a soft breeze. The peeper, with its pear-shaped body and bright fluid notes, was the most familiar voice of the night. Courtesans plucked its strings with fingertips hardened by practice, yet softened by grace, producing melodies that could shift from playful to melancholic with a single change of tempo. Alongside it, the Guqin offered deeper, more meditative tones, slow, trembling, vibrations that seemed to resonate directly in the chest. Guests who closed their eyes often swore they could hear mountains, rivers, and vast open skies within its unhurried rhythms. Bamboo flutes added another layer, carrying warm, breathy notes that floated above the district like birds crossing a dusk sky. Small ensembles sometimes gathered spontaneously in tea houses or pavilions, blending instruments the way calligraphers blend ink. The result was not a performance meant to dazzle, but an atmosphere meant to envelop, each note placed with care, each silence allowed to breathe. Calligraphy offered a different kind of quiet magic. Courtesans kept inkstones ready at all times, along with brushes of wolf, rabbit, or goat hair selected for specific strokes. When a guest expressed interest, a woman might kneel beside a low table and grind ink slowly, allowing its fragrance to rise before guiding the brush across fresh paper. The act was meditative, its beauty lying not only in the finished characters, but in the fluid motion of wrist and arm. Some wrote classical verses, others painted free-flowing characters meant to match the mood of the evening. Guests often found themselves mesmerized, not by the meaning of the words, but by the serenity of the process, the way each stroke seemed to gather emotion and release it with controlled precision. To witness music and calligraphy in Keong's floating world was to understand that artistry here was not ornamental, but essential. It created moments that required nothing but presence. And in a world where so much of life rushed forward relentlessly, these arts invited guests to pause, to breathe, to listen, to watch ink bloom on paper, and realize that beauty could be both delicate and enduring. The pleasure quarters of Kiang were shaped as much by those who visited them as by those who performed within them. Each night drew in a mosaic of personalities, scholars, merchants, government officials, travelers, and dreamers, all seeking something different, yet all softened by the district's gentle spell. Here, status blurred, titles lost their stiffness, and people met one another not through rank, but through mood, curiosity, and shared appreciation for subtle beauty. Scholars were among the most common visitors. Many had spent the day buried in the rigors of preparing for the imperial examinations, a system that demanded perfect memory, flawless reasoning, and endless discipline. By the time evening arrived, their minds ached with confusion, classics, and bureaucratic anxieties. In the floating world, they found release. Tea houses became their temporary me's, where debates flowed more freely, and courtesans skilled in literature offered insights that surprised even the most confident young intellectuals. Some scholars left with new verses to ponder, others left with hearts gently stirred by a courtesan's calm smile. Merchants weary from negotiation and travel came seeking something different, companionship that didn't hinge on profit. They enjoyed the warmth of a shared drink, stories exchanged beside lantern light, and the comfort of being treated not as negotiators, but as humans. Many brought exotic goods from distant provinces, spices, fabrics, carved trinkets, and gifted them to their favorite courtesans, hoping not to buy affection, but to honor artistry. Officials arrived cautiously, wrapped in layers of duty and secrecy. Yet within the pleasure quarters, even strict-faced bureaucrats softened. Some sought intellectual sparring partners. Others sought silence. A few came simply to observe, finding comfort in watching life unfold without needing to control it. The courtesans understood how to navigate these men, listening without judgment, offering empathy without obligation. Then there were the wanderers, individuals with stories the road had shaped, soldiers between assignments, monks passing through the capital, entertainers from other cities, and young dreamers unsure of their place in the world. They came without expectations, content simply to sit beneath lanterns, sip warm tea, and feel part of a wider, gentler human tapestry. What bound all these groups together was a shared desire for refuge. The pleasure quarters were not an escape from responsibility, but a pause from its weight, a place where emotion, beauty, and conversation flowed freely. Here, every visitor, no matter their origin, found a small corner of belonging in Kiang's luminous night. As night in Kiang slowly thinned into the pale edges of dawn, the pleasure quarters began their quiet transformation. Lanterns, once glowing like warm constellations, flickered as their oil ran low. The music softened, conversations tapered off, and the floating world, so alive only hours before, began to fold itself gently away, like silk robes being carefully stored after an evening of elegance. The streets at this hour carried a rare stillness. The laughter and footsteps that had echoed beneath the eaves were now muted, replaced by the soft sweep of brooms and the rustle of early morning vendors preparing their stalls. The scent of jasmine and heated wine faded, replaced by the cooler fragrance of dew on stone and the faint sweetness of steamed buns rising in nearby kitchens. Tea houses closed their carved doors one by one, curtains falling like tired eyelids after a long night of stories, debates, and hushed secrets. Within the flower pavilions, courtesans extinguished their candles and loosened their elaborate hairstyles, letting the long weight of their day slip free. Their instruments rested on low tables, strings cooling in the morning air. The women moved with a gentler, more private grace now, not the polished performance of the night, but the quiet routine of those who live between two worlds. Some sat by their windows, watching the sky brighten. Others wrote a final line of calligraphy to settle their minds before sleep. For them, dawn marked not the beginning, but the end. Hidden gardens fell completely silent. Moonlit ponds that had reflected whispered confessions now mirrored the earliest hints of sunlight. The koi moved lazily, undisturbed by the absence of voices. The pavilion stood empty, their paper, windows glowing softly, as if holding the last traces of the night's memories. Even here, the atmosphere shifted from enchantment to rest, from intimacy to stillness, too. Patrons departed slowly, stepping out with the lingering softness that the district so carefully cultivated. Scholars held their robes a little tighter, thinking over poems recited hours earlier. Officials walked with lighter expressions, their burdens temporarily eased. Merchants breathed in the cool morning air, savoring the rare feeling of a night spent not in negotiation, but in gentle company. By the time the sun rose fully, the floating world had nearly vanished. The pleasure quarters appeared ordinary again, just another part of the city. Yet those who had walked its lantern-lit paths carried something with them, the sensation of having lived, even briefly, in a realm shaped by art, beauty, and human connection. And they knew that when night returned, Kiang's hidden world would awaken once more, ready to offer another evening of soft light, refined companionship, and dreams painted in music and silk. When people imagine Alexander the Great, they picture the battles, the dust of Isis, the river charge at the highest, the phalanx locked in gleaming formation. But none of those victories would have existed without something quieter, far less glamorous, yet infinitely more impressive, the logistical machine behind him. His army did not simply march across continents because they were brave. They marched because every step was calculated, because the supplies flowed, because the system worked. From the moment Alexander left Macedon in 334 BCE, he wasn't just leading an army. He was commanding a moving city of nearly 40,000 men. This city stretched for kilometers when on the move with soldiers, cavalry, engineers, siege specialists, medics, blacksmiths, cooks, scribes, and interpreters. Behind them came thousands of animals, mules, camels, pack horses, each loaded with tools, food, spare weapons, and medical supplies. The army had no trucks, no engines, no radios, yet it coordinated movement across some of the harshest terrain on Earth with a precision modern militaries still study. Alexander inherited a brilliant system from his father, King Philip II, but he refined it ruthlessly. The army traveled light, extraordinarily light for its size. Soldiers carried only essential gear, weapons, armor, a cloak, a few days' worth of grain, and often a simple cooking pot. Tents were mostly reserved for officers. Ordinary soldiers slept under the open sky, reducing baggage weight and increasing speed. The less they carried, the faster they moved, and speed for Alexander was as deadly as a spear. But movement was only half the story. The real miracle lay in supplying the army. Alexander understood that fuel, food, water, fodder, was as important as bronze and iron. His scouts rode days ahead, mapping wells, rivers, and villages. Local cooperation was negotiated before the army ever arrived. If an area couldn't support the troops, routes were changed. If grain was needed, caravans were organized. If the land was barren, rations were adjusted and marches were shortened to avoid exhaustion. This careful choreography made Alexander's army something almost unnatural for its time. A force that could move swiftly, strike suddenly, and survive in environments where other armies would starve. The logistics were invisible to most, but they were the heartbeat, the silent engine, the reason a young king could take one army across deserts, mountains, and empires and never let it collapse under its own weight. Feeding 40,000 men was not a challenge. It was a crisis waiting to happen every single day. Alexander's commanders understood this better than anyone. A soldier could fight without sleep. He could march with bleeding feet. But without food and water, the army collapsed. Discipline vanished, and the momentum of the campaign died. So before any battle, any victory, any moment of glory, there was grain. Tons of it hauled, bought, taxed, or foraged to keep the machine alive. The backbone of the army's diet was barley and wheat. Each soldier consumed roughly a kilogram a day. Multiply that by tens of thousands. Add cavalry horses, pack animals, and the herds that followed the army, and the numbers spiraled quickly into something staggering. Alexander solved this not with stockpiles, which slowed movement, but with constant acquisition. His scouts and quartermasters rode ahead, securing agreements with towns and villages before the army arrived. They negotiated grain, fodder, salt, dried meat, and sometimes livestock, all delivered directly to the army's route. When cooperation failed, the Macedonians foraged aggressively. This wasn't random plundering, it was an organized sweep. Units spread out across a radius around the marching column, gathering grain, cutting fodder, and seizing supplies. But Alexander preferred diplomacy over destruction. Burn a village today, and there's no food tomorrow. Secure its loyalty, and the supply line strengthens. The cavalry required even more attention. A war oar, 8 as much as 10 men, and Alexander had thousands. Grasslands determined routes as much as strategy. In barren regions, herds of sheep and cattle marched with the army, creating a living supply line. Fresh meat, milk, hides, all moved on 4 legs, eating the land under them and feeding the army as needed. Water was the ultimate dictator of movement. On the march, the army often left at dawn, stopping at rivers or wells by noon before heat became lethal. Scouts identified water sources days ahead, marking safe routes across regions where a single mistake could mean dehydration and death. Alexander treated supply not as an afterthought, but as an invisible battlefield. Winning this battle meant his men stayed strong. Losing it meant collapse. Every day the army marched, the supply officers fought their own war. One measured not in casualties, but in grain sacks, hoof prints, and the precious sound of water flowing where it was needed. Most Alexander's victories are often remembered for their heroic clashes, phalanx versus empire, cavalry versus chaos. But the real battleground lay beneath the soldiers' feet. Terrain was both enemy and ally. Roads, mountains, rivers, deserts, and passes shaped the pace, direction, and survival of the campaign. Far more than any general's intentions, Alexander understood this instinctively. He treated land the way a master sailor treats wind, something to respect, exploit, and never underestimate. The Macedonian army moved along routes chosen with obsessive precision. Scouts and engineers rode ahead, studying the ground, measuring distances, locating water, and evaluating whether a column miles long could pass. A road too narrow or muddy could snarl the entire army and expose it to ambush. A river too swift could drown hundreds of men and animals. Time and again, Alexander avoided disaster simply by altering a route by a few miles. A small adjustment with massive consequences. Crossing mountains was among the hardest tasks. The Balkan Rangers, the Taos Mountains, and especially the Hindu Kush, tested the army beyond endurance. Narrow passes forced men to march single file. Cold turned weapons brittle. Snow blinded horses. Avalanches and rockfalls threatened entire units. Yet Alexander planned each ascent with mathematical calm. Breaks at sheltered ledges. Fires prepared in advance. Pack animals redistributed to prevent accidents, and reserves of grain saved specifically for these deadly climbs. The deserts were even worse. The Syrian steppe, the fringes of Mesopotamia, and later the Gedrosian. Desert presented a kind of warfare without an enemy. Heat, thirst, disorientation. Alexander's movement through these regions depended entirely on prior information. Local guides, captured scouts, traders, and nomads were interrogated or bribed for knowledge of wells, hidden springs, and shaded wadis. A single incorrect direction could doom thousands. Alexander's genius was not just following advice, but choosing the right advisors. Even open plains required skill. The army marched in flexible, blocks, keeping cavalry close to protect supply trains. Engineers improved roads on the spot, leveling earth, laying planks over marshy ground, and reinforcing banked river edges. Where bridges didn't exist, they built them. Where rivers were too wide, Alexander used fais, rafts, or captured ships. Every crossing was a construction project executed at military speed. Movement wasn't just transportation, it was strategy. By mastering the land, Alexander mastered time. He arrived when enemies thought him weeks away. He struck before they believed movement was possible. Terrain didn't slow him, it amplified him. And that more than any sword made his campaign unstoppable. No ancient campaign survived on strength alone. Armies without information walked blind into deserts, ambushes, empty storehouses, and poisoned wells. Alexander understood this better than any commander of his age. His empire was built not just by phalanxes, but by eyes and ears, scouts, informants, interpreters, diplomats, and local guides who form the nervous system of his logistical machine. Every march began with reconnaissance. Days before the main column moved, Alexander's Promoi light cavalry scouts rode out in wide arcs ahead, sometimes covering 50 kilometers a day. They mapped terrain, checked water sources, counted livestock in villages, and watched for hostile forces. Their reports determined everything: the road, the pace, the timing, the need for supplies. A wrong report could kill thousands. The good ones saved them, but scouts alone weren't enough. Alexander relied heavily on local cooperation. In Asia Minor, he negotiated with Greek cities who gladly opened their gates. In Syria and Mesopotamia, he made deals with caravan traders who knew every well and oasis. In Bactria and Sogdia, he turned captured tribal leaders into guides rather than enemies, offering them positions, wealth, or amnesty. Alexander understood something simple but rare for his time. A coerced guide tells you where you want to go. A willing guide tells you where you need to go. Linguistic intelligence was crucial. The army employed interpreters skilled in Persian, Aramaic, Egyptian, and dozens of regional dialects. They questioned villagers about food stores, asked shepherds about mountain passes, and listened to merchants' rumors about enemy movements. Sometimes Alexander himself conducted interrogations. His curiosity was legendary. A single shepherd, a caravan driver, even a child who knew where a hidden spring lay could determine whether the next day's march ended in success or disaster. Diplomacy served logistics as much as strategy. Alexander frequently sent envoys ahead of the army to negotiate supplies, request safe passage, or intimidate local rulers into cooperation. Cooperation meant food and water. Resistance meant scorched earth and starvation, so Alexander made cooperation profitable: protection for loyalty, autonomy for obedience, and honor for assistance. Local elites often preferred partnership to destruction. Information allowed the army to move like a precision weapon. Without intelligence, the phalanx might still fight bravely, but bravery doesn't locate rivers, refill grain storerooms, or reveal hidden roads. Alexander's scouts and informants didn't just support the campaign, they enabled it. They turned the unknown into the predictable, and the predictable into victory. Battles may have defined Alexander's legend, but sieges defined his endurance. Taking a walled city was not a matter of courage, it was a matter of logistics. Engineering supplies, manpower, timber, tools, food reserves, and above all, time. Every siege drained resources at a terrifying pace, and yet Alexander never hesitated to assault a fortified city because he had mastered the unmistakable rhythm of siege warfare: build, supply, pressure, and outlast. When the army laid siege to a city, the first order was not to attack, it was to build. Engineers and carpenters stepped forward with tools, axes, and ropes. They required huge quantities of timber for ladders, battering rams, catapults, torsion engines, siege towers, and protective screens. This timber came from forests miles away, cut by labor detachments who marched with axes rather than spears. The trees were felled, shaped, loaded onto carts or pack animals, and hauled to the siege lines. The army became a construction workforce overnight. Alexander's engineers were among the finest in the ancient world. They analyzed walls, identified weak points, calculated angles for artillery, and directed the placement of siege towers. Carpenters built platforms and walkways. Miners dug tunnels beneath walls, propping them with timber that could later be burned to collapse entire sections. Every structure required a steady flow of nails, ropes, pulley, hides, shields, and spare wood. Siege logistics resembled running a massive workshop under hostile fire. Food became a bigger challenge during sieges because the army stopped moving. When stationary consumption rose while foraging decreased to compensate, Alexander pre planned supply lines before beginning a siege. Grain was